Hi, I'm David Hackoff, Executive Director of NewFest, and thank you for joining us for Speak Out, a conversation about LGBTQ journalism. We have a really incredible lineup of panelists for you. I'm grateful to have you here. This is one of many conversations that we're having as part of this year's festival. You should check out our YouTube and Facebook channel for conversations around centering Black, trans, and queer voices in film, around queering the vote. Tomorrow we have a panel on LGBTQ global advocacy and several more. So please do visit newfest.org or our Facebook or YouTube channels for all of those videos. And visit our website, newfest.org, for the 120 LGBTQ films that we have as part of this year's festival. It's a really amazing lineup that represents all aspects of the LGBTQ experience. So I'm really excited to hear this panel today. Journalists are playing an essential role in saving our democracy in this moment, in the weeks leading up to the election. And to introduce the panelists, we have a good friend of NewFest, NBC Out Editorial Director, Brooke Sopelsa.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the introduction, David. I am Brooke Sopelsa, and I am delighted to be joined by Kate Sosin, a reporter for nonprofit news site The 19th, focusing on LGBTQ issues, particularly trans rights, incarceration, politics, and public policy, and Ebone Bell, editor-in-chief of TAGG magazine, a publication focused on lesbian and queer issues. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hello.
Hi. But I like that little shimmy. By way of introduction, I'd love to know how you both got the journalism bug and how your career so far took you to your current roles. Ebone, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I always say that my life kind of led me to this point. I was an editor in my high school paper. Don't worry, I'm not going to go too far back here. And I just love doing like spotlights and things like that. And then went into college and majored in advertising and marketing on a journalism scholarship, actually, which was really cool. And then worked for the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Chronicle of Philanthropy. And what's funny is if you hadn't told me like 10, 15 years ago I'd be running a magazine, I would tell you that you were crazy, that there was no way. But I feel like I'm supposed to be here because I'm supposed to tell our stories. And once I started TAGG, I just knew that there was something special there, especially with telling our stories. I started the publication because all I was seeing was white gay men images and stories being told within our own LGBTQ media outlets, especially here in DC. That's where I started out. That's where I am right now. And so I wanted to start telling stories of queer women of color, trans folks, and make sure, I have an ongoing joke that I want to tell everybody's story. So I'm going to be here for a really long time. It's our readers, it's the stories that we tell that give me that bug, that keep me going. And I love being able to tell our stories because I always say we can't wait for other people to tell our stories. We got to do it ourselves.
Absolutely. And Kate?
I love that. I think it's really silly the way I decided to start journalism, which is that when you're reading about history and you're like in school or whatever, I read about muckrakers as like a child, probably in middle school. And I was like, oh, that's a great thing to do, and I thought that was like a real profession you could have. And I was like, oh, that's what I'm going to do. I had read, I don't know, probably like Upton Sinclair. And I was like, that's a noble profession. And so we had to write essays about what we were going to do. And I was like, I'm going to be a muckraker. And I never really, no one ever told me, that's not really a thing that people do. It's like investigative reporter. And so as I got older, I continued to write and I wanted to be a writer, but I just never really lost the bug for thinking that this was like a really noble profession that that I would do. And I just kept being interested in it. I was editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, and I was constantly getting in trouble by writing, like op-eds that were complaining about how the administration wouldn't let boys wear earrings, and that was wrong. And then, just sort of kept at it. And when I was in undergrad, I actually ended up doing a study abroad in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, where my brother-in-law is from, and did reporting there, and then just sort of stuck with it, and ended up in queer media. So yeah, it kind of felt like it was always there for me. I don't know. It didn't feel like a choice.
I had the opposite experience where I studied economics in college and thought I was going to be a businesswoman, and just sort of fell into journalism because there was a local TV station by my parents' house where I was living after college, like many people who can't afford their own apartment. And then just ended up getting like an post-college internship. Maybe it wasn't even legal, but just got the news bug there and stayed in it, from general super local news, like reporting on garage sales in church basements in the local community. I mean, it was very local, to then business news, to then general news, to, finally in the last couple of years, LGBTQ news, which was sort of the coming together of my professional passion and my personal passion, which is LGBTQ rights. So a circuitous path, but I got here nonetheless.
Can I ask how long did it take you before you were like, I want to edit? Like, that's,
the NBC Out job was when I launched NBC Out. That was the first time I really edited, and it was sort of being thrown into the deep end. But I say a lot of editors miss reporting. I love editing. I think I'm a much better editor than I ever was a reporter. I kind of, I love like being that person that takes someone's like near perfect work and just kind of polishes it and tries to make it as perfect as can be. I think I'm unique as an editor, and that I don't really miss being in like the nitty gritty of reporting. But yeah, so only the past like 4 or 5 years.
And you majored in economics.
Economics. You know what? I was so aimless. That's what my mom told me to major in. Isn't that pathetic? But anyway,
no, it's not pathetic at all.
People are impressed by economics on a resume, I've learned. So I'm just embracing it. I mean, don't ask. Well, thanks. Thank you. The title of this panel is incorporates the LGBTQ lens when it comes to journalism. And I think by default, the three of us look at not just journalism, but the world through an LGBTQ lens. And I'm wondering how that, you think, influences your reporting. And then kind of broader than that, what you think the importance of having folks with that LGBTQ lens is in newsrooms, whether they're, specifically LGBTQ newsrooms, like Out, Advocate, or broader, like NBC News, New York Times, the 19th. So I will start with you, Ebone.
Sure. So obviously, the publication is for LGBTQ women. So the lens is right there. But I think when stories or things happen around us, the first question always is, how does this affect us? Meaning, like, how does this affect our readers? How does this affect the LGBTQ community? Because that's our focus, again, is telling our stories and educating our readers and providing resources as well. So that's the lens that we always look through. So when something maybe major happens in politics, okay, we know that this person said this or this law was passed. How does that affect our community, and why does our community care? Because sometimes those stories don't relate to us, so we may not report on it. And sometimes it does, COVID, for example, COVID, and I know we're going to talk about that probably a little bit later. But there are specific ways that COVID does, affect our community more than it might our counterparts. So that's the question that we always ask. When I say we, that's me and my staff. How does this affect us? And why do our readers want to know about it?
And Kate, how about you?
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started out, I didn't necessarily want to be an LGBTQ reporter. I just wanted to be a reporter. And I graduated into the recession in 2008 and couldn't find a job in journalism. And the people that would take me were the LGBTQ paper in Chicago, Windy City Times. And what I didn't realize was that I was sort of finding a calling by working for them. But what I didn't realize was that, there were so many issues specific to LGBTQ communities that were going unreported, right? It wasn't, and that in just situating yourself sort of in that community, every time something happened, it was happening disproportionately to LGBTQ people. And it was not being reported in mainstream press, or was being reported really poorly. And if you could just even accurately portray it, you were doing a service. And in some ways that remains to be the case in mainstream media. And it's really funny to me, even still, like I'll do pieces that I'm like, well, this is the obvious piece, right? Like LGBTQ people are disproportionately affected by COVID, right? That seems obvious for so many reasons. Or and you'll do that piece in mainstream, and people are like, wow, that's amazing work. And I'm like, okay, like I'm like, we all live this, right? Like we're all, people are like, your work is just like blowing my mind. And I'm like, okay, but like all of us are like actually like living this reality, right? And like I get it and I appreciate it, but I'm like, the whole community is doing this work. Like we're all just putting this out here, right? And so to me, it's critically important that we have more LGBTQ people, trans people, people of color telling these stories, because the fact that these stories that feel like we are living them every day are entering sort of the mainstream and feel so new or big is alarming, frankly. It's just there's so many stories that need to be told, and we're barely scratching the surface, it feels like.
Oh yeah, I always say my most difficult decision every day is deciding what we cannot report on, just because we don't have the manpower. The news cycle, I mean, especially the past year or so, but the news cycle when it comes to LGBTQ news has been such that, I mean, we probably publish, I'd say 3 to 6 stories per day in my section, but we could easily publish a dozen, easily, if we had the manpower. For me, I've always worked for, mainstream outlets, even for NBC Out. I mean, while we have our own landing page and our own microsite in many ways, we're the LGBTQ section of NBCnews.com. Probably the majority of our readership are coming to us through the NBCnews.com homepage, the flagship NBC News social accounts. And, those are folks who are, across the gender and sexuality spectrum. Most of them, I imagine, are probably heterosexual, cisgender. But, even before my focus in reporting was LGBTQ issues, looking back, I was always looking at things through a queer lens. I mean, granted, when I was working in business news, that was a bit harder to do. But, I remember at CNBC in Pride Month, doing a creating this big poster that we put throughout CNBC. And this was like, a buttoned up business cable news channel in, 2006. LGBTQ CEOs and business leaders. And we had this like poster of 20 out business leaders. And it was, for Pride Month. So I always found a way to sort of combine whatever I was doing with LGBTQ issues, whether it was, reporting that was going on the site or things that were happening at my organization. But then even when I worked at the Huffington Post for a couple of years, I helped launch HuffPost Live, which was a very ambitious live streaming network that Huffington posted for a few years. And we were all generalists, but we sort of all started reporting on issues that were of interest to us. And that's where I really was able to, kind of zero in on LGBTQ issues, but also because I had a business news background, I was like the LGBTQ producer and the business news producer, which was an interesting combination. But there were a lot of queer people on that team. And it was like HuffPost Live was like HuffPost Gay Live. It was all of us were sort of looking at things through a queer lens. And it was probably like more gay than anybody had ever intended. But even now in my work at NBC News, I mean, there's always like Ebone mentioned, like whatever the story is, like there's a queer angle. Pandemic, I mean, we've probably published 36 LGBTQ related pandemic stories. Every Trump administration policy has an LGBTQ angle. And I think because we're living in like we're by default. Kate Sosin, am I boring you? Are you yawning on me?
It's like 7:30 LA time. I'm literally still having my coffee.
I'm surprised you are
Forgive
up.
me. I wake up so early anyway. It's just
that's why I can never do the LA.
I'm halfway through this.
You're like working on LA time and New York time. Crazy. I give you credit.
And we're home stretch of this election cycle, so.
Oh my gosh, yes. I was like, finishing prep for this panel while having like one ear on the Amy Coney Barrett hearings. So it's always fun, always multitasking. I wanted us all to kind of take a look back at this absolutely insane news cycle that we've all been working through, living through. And I want to talk about some of our reporting highlights. And since I've been starting with Ebone for the past few questions, Kate, I'm starting with you on this question. I mean, I've been following your reporting, and before the 19th, you did some kick-ass reporting for us at NBC News. But kind of looking back on this news cycle, what are one or two stories that you are just most proud of in all the cake butt reporting you've done?
I'm trying to remember what's happened in the last few weeks. What have I reported on? There's a presidential election. That
little election that's coming up.
There's something about that. You know what? I think we've done a lot of reporting on obviously the presidential election and laying out for folks what is at stake with the Supreme Court nomination. And that has felt important for people. But I think informative, but the story that has really stuck with me most is Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago ended their practice of doing intersex surgeries, and just about everyone covered it. It was a big deal. A long campaign done by a group of activists, Pigeon Pagonis and Sean Saifa Wall led that campaign, and I've known Pigeon for forever from Chicago, and because everyone did it, and I felt like we had to do a story on it, I felt like I could take more time with it and was able to do a story that looked back at the history of these surgeries, and the racist legacy of them, and look at the family history of Saifa, and the pain of those surgeries. And it felt so, I just felt like so grateful to get to tell that story. It was really moving story about Saifa's uncle actually having intersex surgery and being forced to, in the Jim Crow South, recover from surgery on a porch of a hospital because he wasn't allowed to recover in the hospital, right? And the history of gynecology being so racist and that being the foundation for these intersex surgeries. And I just felt really shattered by learning this history. And I know that it's the foundation for so much more reporting because so many other hospitals continue to do these surgeries. So I don't know if I felt proudest of that. I felt most moved by that. I felt lucky to get to take the time to do that story.
I think another really interesting aspect of that story more broadly was just the impact of the activism, because I believe that Chicago hospital was where Pigeon Pagonis had been subjected to intersex surgery. And that's why that hospital became the focus and eventually became, I think, the first hospital, right, to come out and say that they would no longer perform these surgeries on infants. And, I just thought that was such a powerful message, that here are activists who were putting the work in for years, as you said, and it had a big impact that will probably have a domino effect, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing about Lurie, this hospital, is they are world renowned for their transgender care. They have some of the best trans affirming medical care for kids in the country. So it felt like, such a weird, people accuse them of being really hypocritical, right? Mm-hmm. They affirm trans kids, not intersex kids. So.
And Ebone, how about you? TAGG has done some awesome work over the past year and beyond. Just looking back on this year's news cycle, and there's so much to look back on. What are one or two stories that you've been most proud of?
So I wouldn't necessarily say one story opposed to one of our issues. Mm-hmm. And like a lot of media outlets or businesses, we were hit really hard with the pandemic. And in fact, where for the first time ever, we had to skip an issue, our May-June Pride issue, which at the time just didn't make sense to come out anyway. But our July-August issue, we thought after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so many other Black people in our community losing their lives to police violence and such, especially also Black trans women. For the first time, we came out with a Black Lives Matter issue, which I'm probably most proudest of, specifically Black Queer Lives Matter issue. I thought as a Black queer person that it was important. I can't tell you how exhausting this year has been. I think obviously you all know that, but especially as a Black person, as a queer person, it is exhausting. So I remember when all of these things happened, and we waited to put out any statement just because we had to heal and figure out, okay, what's the best approach? And we thought giving Black queer voices during this time a voice. And so the issue included, talking about how, we forget that there are Black queer people. We keep saying Black Lives Matter, but we're still seeing trans women, even within our own community, being violated, being murdered. And that's a problem. The organizers of Black Lives Matter, two of them, I believe, are queer women. So it's just interesting and ironic that sometimes our own Black siblings forget that we have a voice in Black Lives Matter, and there is such a thing as intersectionality. And yes, we happen to be queer, but at the end of the day, people don't look at that first. They look at the color of our skin. So that was a really powerful feature that Sandra Morris wrote. I have to give her credit for that. We also included Black trans women that we've lost this year. And unfortunately, by the time it printed, there were about 2 or 3 more women that, that were killed that we couldn't include in print, which is, it's just really unfortunate. And then we also had a Black queer self-care. Again, that just came from, we know how people are feeling. I personally know how you are feeling. What are we doing to heal ourselves? And that's another thing. Not only do we look through an LGBTQ lens, but a lot of times I say, okay, this is happening. How can we be a part of the solution? And this issue was exactly that. Spotlighting Black queer activists, spotlighting Black trans women, spotlighting Black queer folks in self-care and how we take care of ourselves as we continue to be a part of this movement, as we continue to see people in our community being violated by police brutality. So by far, that issue was probably the proudest issue for me that we've ever come out with.
One of the things that we produced that I was most proud of was our Black and Queer in America special in June, where, we really looked at things. We combined sort of pride, the protests that were going on. We covered, I think it was, the special was about 45 minutes to an hour, which gave us a lot of room to cover a number of issues that we had been reporting on, like violence against Black trans women, which this year has reached record levels, just in terms of reported killings of trans folks, which I'm sure is a vast undercount because of all of the misreporting and people getting misgendered. So we touched upon violence against trans Black folks, and just how, white LGBTQ people can be better allies. And I think that's a conversation that we're just starting to have this past year. And it's reached a level where this is a conversation that's really starting to happen, I think, on some kind of level that will have an impact. But another issue that I'm really proud of our coverage has been just keeping up with the Trump administration's policies and measures. Whether it's the Trump administration filing amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, arguing that gay and trans people should not be covered under federal civil rights law when it comes to workplace protection, to, a lot of it has been amicus briefs. And, that's not a very sexy topic, but it's an important topic. When the president's administration is writing a brief to the Supreme Court about a transgender plaintiff and not once using her pronouns, that's something that absolutely needs to be reported on. And that's something that everyone in the queer community and beyond should know about. May not be the sexiest topic to report on, but it's an important topic. And there's also been a lot of misinformation about the Trump administration's policies. And I think we're able to, with the resources of NBC News, and I know, Kate, you've done some amazing reporting on the administration. We're able to kind of report on these issues in a nuanced and factual way that I just saw a video, a lesbian influencer posted a video about the Trump administration, and it was sort of this, busting myths, media myths about Trump. And it included so much misinformation that I was like, oh my goodness. Just one example was that the Obergefell decision, which was the 2015 decision that legalized same-sex marriage across the United States, what involved Kim Davis, was the Kim Davis decision. And I'm like, what? And then they also mentioned that the Trump administration was in favor of trans and gay people being covered under federal civil rights workplace discrimination protections because Neil Gorsuch, who Trump appointed, voted in favor of queer people being included. And I'm like, Gorsuch is not part of the Trump administration. He may have been nominated by Trump, but the Trump administration actually filed a Supreme Court brief arguing against queer people being included in Title VII workplace protections. So there's just so much misinformation out there that I'm proud of the way that we have been factually covering the administration in all of its measures. Sorry, Kate, did you want to say something?
Well, I mean, this brings up something though, is your sense that an average cisgender straight person has a pulse on the level to which this administration has rolled back LGBTQ protections?
Absolutely not.
Right.
I think that there are, I think now the bar for politicians across the political spectrum has, I think, been pretty low when it comes to being in favor of LGBTQ rights, right? Especially Republicans. And in the Republican committee's kind of the GOP playbook, I forgot what it's called. It's the platform, the National Republican Platform, right?
Yeah.
This year, instead of issuing a new platform, they've readopted the 2016 platform. They're continuing to use that. That platform still says at least half dozen times that marriage should be between one man and one woman exclusively, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have that, but then you also have the Trump tweeting out an unscientific poll that says 45% of gay men support him in the upcoming election, right? You have him having an openly gay man speak at the Republican National Convention. You have some of these things where he has undeniably raised the bar for a Republican president in support of LGBTQ rights at some level, right?
Has
but
he
the bar, I mean, in terms of just having a gay person speak, an openly gay person speak at the convention, both conventions, 2016 and this year, acknowledging the LGBTQ community in some small way. But the bar was so low that it would be hard in this day and age for a lawmaker to not raise it at least a bit. But that said, sorry, go on. What were you going to say, Kate?
I mean, it's also hard though to find even a Republican president who is actively, aggressively targeted and hostile toward LGBTQ people historically.
Well,
which is to say,
trans people in particular. But that's only because trans people have accumulated some form of rights over the past few years. There was nothing, I think in the past, Republican lawmakers, this was an absolute non-issue. They had no rights anyway. I think only since they've accumulated some rights has the administration started to roll them back. I think if there were trans rights under previous Republican administrations, they probably would have been rolled back or attempted to be rolled back as well. But that said, I do think that there is, just from what I've seen, and not just the presidential administration, I think more broadly in the Republican Party, I do think that there has been an attempt to sort of separate the L, G, and the B from the T. And I think that there's definitely been more of a focus on trans people and rolling back trans rights than there has necessarily been on gay rights. And gay rights have come in the form of religious freedom measures, which I think is that's not really a sexy topic as well, you know? And I think it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around how that impacts gay people.
Yeah.
You know? Religious freedom measures, though, from what we've reported on, largely impact gay people.
Right.
So,
yeah, this is, I mean, it's so interesting too, because we've seen very recently all of this polling come out about Republican voters and where they are on LGBTQ issues, and they're not with this administration, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're even on trans issues, right? Even on these sports bills limiting trans athletic participation, they don't
Mm-hmm.
really care about this. The Human Rights Campaign did a poll on, voters in swing states, and they looked at Democrats and they looked at Republicans, and Republicans they either don't care or they would much prefer candidates who are in support of trans equality or LGBTQ equality. And I think that's really interesting. And it speaks to the fact, I think we often assume that this is a Democratic issue, but the fact of the matter is, all of us have LGBTQ people in our lives, whether or not we are LGBTQ. That's our kid, our sibling, our uncle, our friends, and that is the case of the country. People want to be done with this. So,
but then those people, while they may favor LGBTQ rights, will that impact their vote? And will it make more of a difference than the people who are vehemently opposed to LGBTQ rights, and whether that may impact their vote?
I mean, that is such an interesting question, right? So in this poll, largely, no, right? Like most of these voters are voting on the economy. They're voting on COVID right now.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks are single issue voters and vote on abortion, right? And so it depends. I did talk to one mother who said, I am a Trump voter, and but I cannot bring myself to vote against my child. And so she will vote likely for Biden because she cannot bring herself to vote for someone who's hostile to her kids. So that, I think, is interesting.
And I think it also goes to, the point that you had mentioned before, is the level of knowledge that many voters have on the Trump administration's policies toward LGBTQ people. Because, some of them are very nuanced, kind of in the weeds issues. And there's also a lot of misinformation out there about the issues. So it also depends on the level of someone's, research and knowledge, and are they following these amicus briefs, and, are they following the, executive orders? So
advocates have said, they just need to educate now. So, hey, welcome back.
Hey,
welcome back.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what happened. I'm super embarrassed, but I appreciate you guys hanging in there and waiting for me.
We're happy to have you back.
Yeah,
keeping my fingers crossed here.
You're just in time for our next question, which is about the pandemic. And I'll ask you first, because I feel like the pandemic has just upended everything, and it has, it invaded every part of our lives. I mean, certainly it has impacted NBC's coverage. How has the pandemic, Ebone, impacted your coverage, and what types of stories are you telling, either about the pandemic or to sort of be the counterweight to a lot of this, tragic pandemic coverage that people are getting everywhere else?
Sure. So probably the biggest thing that we've done is how it's affecting the LGBTQ community, which I know I mentioned before. We did an article on that exactly. We have to remember that before the pandemic, we had pretty high numbers of, mental health issues, homelessness, unfortunately, suicide as well. So we kind of looked at statistics and what people could do during the pandemic to make sure that they got that support. So we talked a little bit about mental health, because we already know that there was a stigma there before within our community of mental health, as well as drug abuse and alcoholism. So we want to make sure that people have that information, that for the people that need those resources, we were able to provide that. And of course, people who didn't know what was going on and how they can get involved. Again, it's, like you said, it's always looking through the LGBTQ lens, because yes, the pandemic and COVID is affecting all of us, but how is it affecting us specifically within our community, especially in minority communities? We already know that unfortunately they're impacted the largest by this, and some of that is due to socioeconomic circumstances as well. So we've been really kind of on the forefront of making sure that we have that information for people, and that's kind of how we've been also covering it. We also make sure that we have a lighter side to things as well. I always say during these times, it's really important to spotlight queer joy, or Black queer joy, as I like to say, Black and brown queer joy. And so, we've also done some fun things, during quarantine, what people could be doing now to connect with other people, but also, hey, what are some great LGBTQ books or movies that are out now, or documentaries or things like that. So we try to balance it, because we don't want to be too serious, because at the end of the day, one of the greatest things that we can do to fight this is have our joy. And so we've balanced, LGBTQ health along with, hey, there are some great things out there. Let's laugh a little bit.
Definitely. And Kate, how about you?
Pandemic. Yeah. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was not at the 19th and covered it just in terms of what are the disparities that LGBTQ people are facing. And then as this has gone on, just, really looking at how the pandemic might impact access to things like voting has been really interesting. One story that I did was on how the pandemic will impact trans folks at the polls, which is going to be a huge issue. So trans people are disproportionately facing obstacles to voting anyway because of voter ID access. If you don't have an ID that matches your name or the way you look, you might be barred at the polls anyway because of strict voter ID laws. 46% of trans people don't have an ID that matches their name or gender marker. And even in states that don't have those laws, they might be turned away at the polls. So the Williams Institute was already anticipating more than 300,000 people who might have issues at the polls before the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, shut down courts and DMVs who were maybe processing these name changes or IDs. And so we were seeing all these people who needed to register to vote trapped in that process. And that is still an issue. So some states, of course, have opened up or those processes have continued, but there are a lot of people who are still stuck in that. And so looking at, not just how people are affected economically, but also, how those systems that are supposed to work for folks who are trapped in them continue to be, surgeries, which, by the way, a lot of these states, in order to get updated identification, to get registration, you have to have, gender affirming surgery. And those surgeries have been halted because hospitals are, treating COVID patients. And just really talking to folks about what is happening in your life, what has changed for you, to see how this pandemic is really playing out at a ground level has been really important. And then seeing also, like, are there good things that are maybe happening? We had 300 anti-LGBTQ bills in state legislatures that were halted because of the coronavirus. A lot of those bills likely would have moved, and they were totally chilled because of this pandemic. So, lots of sides of this to sort of explore.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to some of our pandemic related coverage, and it is just crossed the spectrum from, Kate, you had mentioned trans surgeries being halted. We did a feature about that. Maybe it was in April or May. Gender affirming surgeries were considered non-essential, which really threw many people's plans into chaos, who have been planning to get these surgeries. We did one story about young people having to move back with their families, especially college students, to quarantine and having to actually go back into the closet. And also just the mental health disparities, the increased loneliness, and then just LGBTQ community centers and other organizations not being able to provide those in-person services that they had once been providing. Though, I agree with you, Ebony, that it's also crucial to sort of have some of those uplifting stories mixed in, even pandemic-related ones. Queer people doing amazing things to help the community amid the pandemic. We actually dedicated our annual Pride list to that. But we'll continue, especially now that, it appears that COVID rates are inching up. We'll be continuing to have our eye on that. And as we start to wind down the conversation, I'd love to know, kind of looking ahead between now and the end of the year, what both of you have on your editorial calendars. I did hear there's a little election happening next month, so maybe that's on your calendar. But Ebony, I'll start with you.
Sure. So we'll definitely, leading up, continue to encourage people to vote, but also be covering the election a little bit more. What I'm hoping is post November 3rd, we'll have some great articles on change in administration. So I'm going to just put that out in the universe. But we're definitely going to be doing more coverage. I mentioned earlier when we were talking that, TAGG is a balance of kind of news and lifestyle. But this will probably be the year that we probably cover more politics than any other time that we have. On a lighter note, like I mentioned, we're one of two LGBTQ women's print publications left in the country. And we are making sure, again, that our latest issue, our November-December issue, is holidays, because again, it's just spreading joy. So that's definitely on our list. We want to make sure, hey, what can we be doing during the holidays? We know there's the pandemic. We know that there's COVID. We know there's an election. Again, we won't know exactly what's going to happen with that. But again, it's just a balance. We want to make sure that people are informed with what's going on with the administration, post-election. And then, of course, let's not forget there are some good things that we can share with friends and family.
And Ebony, how can folks find your content? Your website is taggmagazine.com. How can folks that want to subscribe to your magazine, where can they find information on that?
Thank you for asking that, because we can, always use support, and, we have subscribers across the country and the world, which is amazing. So yes, as you mentioned, people can go to taggmagazine.com right on our homepage. You can check out and subscribe to us under our Tag Swag section. along with our shirts and things like that, which is great. And of course, please feel free to connect with us on social media. As you can imagine, we've been doing a lot of virtual things, of virtual events, opposed to our in-person events. October 19th, we're interviewing Rosie O'Donnell and bringing her in to talk about some things. And I know this will air after, but it will be on our Facebook if you go check that out. So thank you, Brooke.
Thanks. And Kate, what's coming up on your editorial calendar?
Election. It's that's a lot of that. I have big dreams for a lot of stories that are not November 3rd, but I doubt they're coming down the pike before then. So be on the lookout for some election coverage related to the LGBTQ plus community.
Same here. We're going to try to mix it up, but there will be a wide variety of LGBTQ election related stories. Both issues related to the presidential race and presidential policies, but also a report came out from the LGBTQ Victory Fund that found there are going to be 574 LGBTQ folks on November ballots across the US. So yeah, we just published a story, and that's a record. I think it's up like 33% from 2018, which is awesome. So
which
this
was
is like
also
the real
a record.
Yes. So this is like the real rainbow wave. But we just published a story highlighting some of those candidates, and we'll be looking ahead to those races as well, leading up to the election. And then after the election, we'll be continuing to follow the victorious candidates, and we'll be continuing with our pandemic-related coverage as well. Maybe some holiday things sprinkled in there. But my last question for all of us is any advice that you may have to any aspiring journalists that are tuning into our panel. Ebone, I'll start with you. Sure.
If there's anyone out there who's just thinking about creating something, another platform, let's start there. Just do it. Just jump into it and just do it. It's exactly what I did. You'll learn along the way. Again, our stories are important. Visibility is important, and we need that more than ever. As just a journalist, I shouldn't say just a journalist, but a journalist coming in, my advice would be, what's your angle? What do you hope to put out in the world? What are you passionate about? And write about it.
Good advice. Kate?
I would say, the most important thing that you can do to help yourself is just to be really nice to people and, reach out to folks and make friends, and don't be shy about asking people to talk to you. People like me would love to help you. I would love to help you. And I think there are a lot of people like that. We want more LGBTQ reporters in the world, and I'll do whatever I can to make that happen. And I think there's a lot of people like that. And if you're just really, really nice, I think I'm serious, there's a really good community, and that'll get you a lot further than just about anything, really.
So I definitely agree with talking to people, reaching out to folks for informational interviews, though I would suggest not doing it very close to the 2020 election.
Don't bother Brooke right now.
most of us journalists will be batshit crazy up until probably mid-November, and then beyond that. But still, I think waiting till mid-November is some good advice. But also, the barrier to entry now to getting your work out there and work published is so much lower than it was when I was starting out, back in the old days. So, whether I'm not including a year there, Kate, but, think small to begin with. I started at a super small local TV station. They just let me I was doing on-camera reporting within like 3 months. Wow. So I would say, whether it's your high school paper, college paper, whether it's a small blog, get your work out there wherever you can. Talk to people. And also, if you are passionate about LGBTQ issues, you don't necessarily need to just report for LGBTQ publications or focus on LGBTQ issues. We can desperately use people that have an LGBTQ lens reporting everywhere. I think that is also a huge service to the community, to have queer folks with a queer lens in newsrooms everywhere. So that would be my advice. So that wraps up our conversation. Kate and Ebone, thank you so much for joining. I'd love this conversation, and I hope the folks watching at home love it too. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.